What would you do if the only thing your family ever left you was a scrap of ground that every honest man swore was worthless? Cora Rennick was 20 years old the autumn her grandfather died, and that scrap of ground was all she had. Silas Rennick had spent his last years in a rented room above a harness shop, mending bridles for a few coins. When the fever took him, he left behind three things: a worn deed folded into eighths, a smooth gray stone that fit the hollow of her palm, and a story she had never quite believed. The deed named a claim in a place called Ryback Canyon, far out in the dry country where no sensible person settled. The stone was river-rounded, though Cora had never once seen a river near any home the two of them had kept, and the story was the one Silas told her when the lamp burned low and his voice went soft with wanting. He said there was a mill out there, a whole grist mill, timber and wheel and grinding stones, standing in a canyon where the creek had gone dry before her mother was born. He said his own father had raised it by hand, and that it was standing yet, still whole, still waiting on the water. Cora had always smiled and let him talk. A mill needs a stream the same as a lamp needs oil. A mill set down in a waterless canyon was a thing a lonely man dreamed to keep from being lonely. But grief has a habit of making a person take the dead at their word. So Cora did a foolish thing. She sold the little that could be sold, sewed the deed into the lining of her coat, dropped the gray stone in her pocket, and bought passage west toward a canyon nobody wanted. She did not go hunting money, for there was no money in the telling. She went because she needed to know whether the one thing she had left was a real place or only a dying man's kindness to himself. What waited in Ryback was stranger than either hope. It was a wonder that had stood untouched for 70 years, in open sun, where any wanderer might have seen it, and yet none had. A mill that should have fallen and had not. Stones that should have split and had not. A great wheel poised above an empty run of river rock, dressed and greased as though the water had left only the day before. And hidden inside that impossible stillness lay the answer to a question Cora had not yet learned to ask. Not who built the place, who had kept it whole all this time, and why. So settle in with us a while. Pull the blanket up to your chin if the night has turned cool, and let the last light of a long day go soft at the edges. Wherever you happen to be tonight, a warm kitchen, a truck on a dark road, a porch where the crickets have only just started, tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We like to picture you out there, wherever the quiet has found you. This is a tale about the things a family gives up on, and the worth that waits patiently inside them, far longer than anyone believes it should. The stagecoach let her off at a town called Kestrel, and Kestrel was barely a town at all. A store, a livery, a chapel with a leaning steeple, and a scatter of houses the color of the dust that blew against them. The country beyond was red rock and sage. Sandstone walls the shade of old brick rose up on every side, and above them stretched a sky so blue and so wide it made a person feel small in a manner that was almost kind. Cora stood in the road with her satchel and her sewn-in deed, and understood, for the first time, how far she had come to chase a story. Her whole life had fit inside one coach. Now the coach was gone, rattling back toward the wetter country, and she was alone at the edge of a land that did not care whether she had come or not. The store was cool and dim and smelled of coffee and cured leather. Behind the counter, an old man named Odell was weighing dried beans, and he watched her come in with the frank curiosity of a person who did not get many strangers. She asked him for the road to Ryback Canyon, and his hands went still over the scale. "Ryback," he said, as though tasting a word long off the shelf. Now there is a name I have not heard spoke in a good while. What business would a young lady have out in Ryback? I own it, Cora said. Part of it. My grandfather held the claim. Silas Rennick. The old man set down his scoop. He looked at her a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes she could not read. Rennick, he repeated, softly. You would be Josiah's blood then. His grandson's girl. Great-granddaughter, Cora said. I never knew him. I only knew the stories. Odell came around the counter slower than his years strictly required, wiping his hands on his apron. He told her, plainly, that the mill was real, that he had seen it himself as a boy some 40 years gone, and that he had no reason to think it had moved so much as an inch since. But he wanted her to hear the hard part, too. That canyon had been bone-dry since before he could walk. There was not a running cup of water in 20 miles of it. Whatever her grandfather had promised her about the place, no living could ever be scratched from a mill that had no creek to turn it. Folks in that country called the Rennick claim the driest deed in the county, and they did not mean it as a joke. I did not come to make a living, Cora said. I came to see it with my own eyes. The old man studied her again, and whatever he found seemed to settle something in him. He fetched a canteen from a shelf, filled it from his own barrel without being asked, and pressed it into her hands. He told her to take the wash south past the burnt cottonwood and follow the dry bed up between the walls, a hard half-day on foot, keeping always to the shade where the rock leaned over. The sun out there, he said, did not forgive a person who hurried. Then he paused, and his voice changed. And Cora Rennick, if you should meet an old fellow up that canyon, do not be frightened of him. He belongs to the place more than your family ever did. Let him speak first. She wanted to ask what he meant. But Odell had already turned back to his beans, and there is a kind of silence a person learns not to push against. Cora walked out of Kestrel, with the sun still climbing and the whole red country opening in front of her. The wash was easy at first, a wide sandy bottom braided with the ghosts of old water, and she followed it south as she had been told. She passed the burnt cottonwood, a black finger of a tree that must have died a lifetime ago. And there the walls began to close in, and the true canyon began. It was beautiful in a manner that frightened her a little. The sandstone rose on either hand in great smooth folds, striped rose and cream and rust, worn round as poured wax. And the floor of it was cobbled with stones. That was the thing she noticed first. River stones, smooth as the one in her pocket, thousands upon thousands of them, all polished by a water that was no longer there. She took the gray stone from her pocket and turned it in her fingers and understood at last where her grandfather had gotten it. He had walked this bed as a boy. He had carried one small piece of the vanished creek in his pocket his whole life long, 200 miles from the nearest river, and had never once told her what it was. She kept to the shade, as instructed. The heat came off the walls in slow waves, and the silence was enormous, and now and then a raven crossed the strip of blue overhead, and its wing beats sounded loud as a slammed door. She marked her progress by the changing of the rock. Where the walls turned a deep sandstone gold, she reckoned herself 8 miles in. Where a side canyon opened and closed like a held breath, 6 miles remained. 4 miles from the end, she found the first sign that people had lived here once. It was a homestead, or the bones of one. A tumble of squared stones that had been a wall, a rusted iron hoop that had been a barrel, a doorway with no house behind it, framing a rectangle of empty sky, and half sunk in the sand, worn nearly featureless, a child's wooden toy, a little horse on wheels, the string still tied to it. Cora crouched a long time over that toy, and did not touch it. Somebody had loved this canyon. Somebody had left it in a hurry and left a child's whole world behind in the leaving. She rose and went on, quieter than before. The afternoon wore down, and the heat pressed harder, and more than once Cora wondered whether she had thrown away the little she owned to chase a dead man's fancy across a country that plainly wanted no one in it. She rationed the water in Odell's canteen as he had taught her, a mouthful at a time, and she held to the leaning shade, and she counted her own footsteps to keep her mind off the doubt. Twice she stopped where the walls fell back, and simply listened, hoping against all sense for the sound of running water somewhere ahead. There was never any. There was only the tick of cooling rock, and the dry rustle of a lizard, and her own breath, and the vast blue silence pressing down from overhead. It came to her that a person could vanish out here, and no one would ever think to look. And it came to her, too, that her grandfather had walked out of this exact stillness as a young man, and had carried it quietly inside him through every crowded town of his life, and had never told a living soul what the leaving of it cost him. She put her hand over the gray stone in her pocket, for company, and she pressed on. Then the canyon bent hard to the west, and the walls fell back into a wide sunlit bowl, and Cora Rennick stopped where she stood and forgot how to breathe. The mill was there. It stood across the dry bed on the far side of the bowl, and it was exactly as her grandfather had promised, and it was nothing she had let herself believe. 3 stories of weathered timber, silvered by 70 summers of sun until the boards shone soft as pewter. The roof shingles curled but held. The whole tall shape of it leaned just slightly over the empty stream, as though bowing to a river that had gone. And on the near side, hung out above the stones where the creek had run, was the wheel, a great wooden water wheel, taller than 2 men standing one upon the other, its paddles gray and its rim furred with dead moss, canted at the exact angle of the last turn it had ever made. Below it, only round, dry stones. Above it, only blue. It had been poised there, mid-motion, for longer than anyone alive could remember, and it looked as if a single cupful of water would set it moving again. For a long moment Cora could not move at all. The sheer scale of the thing undid her. She stood small against the far wall of the bowl, one young woman in a dusty prairie dress with a satchel on her shoulder, and across from her leaned this impossible relic that had no earthly business standing, and between them lay a river of stones with no river in it. Her mind kept circling the same question, the same as a tongue keeps returning to a missing tooth. How is it here? How is it whole? She crossed the dry bed slowly, stepping stone to stone as a person crosses a memory. The nearer she came, the stranger it grew. The timber was old, checked and weathered to the bone, and yet the door at the base of the mill stood open, square and dark, and it had been swept. She could see that from 20 feet off. The sill was clean. No drift of sand lay across the threshold, though sand had banked against every other still thing in the canyon. A dead world, and one swept step at the heart of it. She stopped in the open doorway and let her eyes adjust, and the cool breath of the place came out to meet her, smelling of old wood and cold stone and faintly of oil. And there they were, the 2 grinding stones. They sat one atop the other on their great oak frame in the center of the floor, pale as 2 moons, each of them broad across as a wagon wheel. Cora had half expected, if they existed at all, 2 cracked and pitted ruins. These were dressed. She knew just enough to know it. The grooves cut into the faces of the stones were sharp and clean. The surfaces swept free of grit, and along the iron spindle that joined them ran a bright film of grease that had not sat there 70 years. Someone had oiled the stones. Recently, in a dead canyon, at the bottom of a story her grandfather had told to make himself less alone, someone had climbed down into this silence and dressed 2 millstones and set them, this very season, to grind. She stood there and let the whole strangeness of it settle over her. All around, the mill wore its 70 years honestly, cobwebbed in the high corners, its ladder gray, its great gears furred with the dust of decades. Only the heart of it, the stones and the spindle and the swept floor beneath them, had been kept alive. Decay everywhere, and tucked inside the decay, one thing tended like a living child. If you had walked all that distance on the strength of a dying man's story, and stepped through that swept door and found the single object in the whole canyon that living hands still cared for, what would you have done? Would you have called out into the cool dark and asked who was there? Or would you have stood still as the stones and listened, afraid of what an answer might mean? Be honest with yourself and say so in the comments below. We are curious which sort of person you are. Cora did not call out. She stood in the doorway with her heart going hard, and she listened, and after a while the listening was rewarded. From the shadows at the back of the mill, past the silent gears and the ladder to the upper floor, came a small dry sound, the scrape of a whetstone against iron, patient, unhurried, the sound of a person at work who has been at that same work so long he no longer thinks of it as work. "You can come in," said a voice out of the dark. It was old and cracked and entirely calm. "The floor is sound. I keep it sound." An old man stepped into the band of light that fell through the door. He was very old, older than Odell, older than anyone Cora had ever spoken to. His back was bent and his beard was white as the millstones, and his hands, when they came into the light, were enormous and scarred and sure. He held a whetstone in one and a millpick in the other, and he regarded Cora as a person regards weather he has been expecting for a very long time. "You have his face," the old man said, "the Rennick jaw. I would have known you in a crowd of 1,000. He set his tools down on the frame with great care. "I am Ephraim Teague. I have kept this mill for 70 years, and you are the one I have been waiting on, though I confess I had near given up you would ever come." Cora found her voice with difficulty. "You knew my grandfather, Silas?" The old man nodded slowly. He had known Silas when the boy was no higher than that spindle, he told her. He had taught the boy to dress a millstone with his own hands, and he had known the boy's father, Josiah, who raised every timber standing around them. Josiah Rennick, he said, was the finest man he had known across a very long life, and he had held the mill against the day one of that man's blood came walking back up the canyon. "Sit down, child," Ephraim said. "You have come a hard road, and there is real water in the jug, and there is a great deal you were never told. It is a long story, but I believe it is yours now. I have been the only soul alive who carries it, and I am glad, I am so glad, not to carry it by myself any longer." Cora sat down on the cool floor of the mill her family had forgotten, across from the old man who had not forgotten it at all, and she let him pour her a cup of water, and she listened. He began with the water. Because everything in Ryback began and ended with the water. "There had been a creek here once," he told her. "Ryback Creek, clear and cold, born of a spring high in the rock and running the length of the canyon the year around. He had been born on its bank. His people had farmed the bottoms along with a dozen other families, and some autumns there was more corn and wheat than a body knew how to store. But grain is not bread. Grain must be ground, and the nearest mill was 3 days' wagon travel over broken country, and half a family's flour spoiled or spilled before ever it reached home. So the valley went hungry in the middle of its own plenty, and the children grew thin in a season of harvest, and no one knew what to do about it. And Josiah built the mill, Korah said softly. Josiah built the mill. The old man's whole face changed. Remembering, he had not been a miller by trade, Ephraim explained. He was a wheelwright and a stubborn man, and he could not abide the waste of it, good grain rotting for want of a stone to grind it. So he had hauled the millstones over the mountains on a wagon it took 4 ox to pull. 1 bad mile at a Sunday, the better part of a year. He raised these timbers with every man in the valley lending a shoulder. He set the wheel into the creek with his own 2 hands. And the day the water first took that wheel and turned it, and the stones first bit down, and the warm flour first came off the grind, the whole canyon wept as though at a wedding. Ephraim had been too small then to remember it, but his mother had told the story to him so many times he half believed he did. For a handful of good years, he said, that canyon was the sweetest place under heaven. The mill turned, and the valley ate its own bread, and Josiah took no more for the grinding than a modest share of the meal, and the poorest family in Ryback never once went to bed hungry. Then the water left. Not slow. In the honest manner a creek ought to fail in a drought. All at once, there came a shaking in the earth one winter, a great deep shudder that cracked the high rock where the spring was born, and it turned the whole flow down into some black road under the mountain that no man has ever found the end of. Ryback Creek ran full on a Tuesday, and by the following Sabbath it was the bed of dry stones Korah had walked in upon. Within 3 winters the families were gone, scattered to wetter ground, their fields returned to sage. Everyone went. But Josiah stayed, Korah said. Josiah stayed, and I stayed at his side. The old man rose and went to the great stones and laid one huge scarred hand flat upon the upper one, as a person rests a hand on the shoulder of an old friend. He said she must know why he stayed, or none of the rest would make sense to her. The winter the water left, he told her, was the same winter his whole family took the fever. His father, his mother, his 2 small sisters, all of them inside the space of a month, and him a boy of 10 with no kin left in the wide world, and a canyon emptying out around him. He had nothing. He had less than nothing. And he would have died that winter, sure as the creek died, but for her great-grandfather. Josiah Rennick had taken the orphaned boy into his own house, Ephraim said, in the very year he had least to give any living soul, when his own dream was collapsing under him and every neighbor he had was loading a wagon to leave. He fed the boy from his own plate. When the last handful of seed grain was all Ephraim owned on earth, Josiah ground it free upon these stones, and would not hear a word about payment. And when the spring came, Ephraim went on, his voice going rough, and the last families were pulling out. I asked him, would he go too? Do you know what he told me? What did he tell you? Korah whispered. Ephraim closed his eyes to bring the words up whole. He said, the water forgets, boy, but stone remembers. This mill will keep faith with this valley even after the valley forgets the mill. And one day the faith gets paid back. It always does, if a body is only patient enough to outlast the forgetting. The old man's voice broke gently on the borrowed words. Josiah had kept those stones dressed until the day he died, he said, an old man believing to the last that the water would return. And on that day he had taken Ephraim's hand and asked one thing of him. Keep it turning ready. Keep faith for me. One day my own blood will come up this canyon, needing to learn who they are, and this mill is how they will find it out. I promised him I would, Ephraim said. And I have kept that promise 70 years. It is the whole of what my life has been. The sun had slid to the canyon rim, and the light through the door had gone the deep red of coals. Cora looked at the old man's ruined hands, hands that had oiled a spindle and dressed a stone every season across 70 years, for a dead man's faith and a dead man's kindness, and she found that she could not speak at all. Ephraim took the cup gently from her fingers and filled it again. He told her she was tired, and it was near dark, and the story was only half told. There were things in this mill her great-grandfather had wanted his blood to see with their own eyes. Ledgers and letters sealed against exactly this day. But those were for the morning and a clear head. Tonight she would eat what an old man had to offer, and sleep on the loft where Silas, her grandfather, had slept as a boy, and let the canyon keep her as it had kept him. That night, Cora lay in the loft under a wool blanket that smelled of cedar, and she listened to the old man's breathing below, and to the enormous silence of the canyon, and to something she could not at first name and then could. Every so often, when the night wind came down the bowl, the great dry wheel outside gave a long, low groan and turned a quarter-inch upon its shaft, and settled, turning ready. 70 years, and still hung true, still waiting on its water. She fell asleep to the small, patient sound of it, and did not dream. In the morning Ephraim showed her the ledgers. They were kept in a tin-lined chest against the back wall, sealed with wax that the old man broke with his thumb, and they were as dry and whole inside as the day they were closed. Josiah Rennick's mill books. Cora lifted the first out and opened it across her knees, and she expected. She hardly knew what: accounts, debts, the dry arithmetic of a business long dead. That is not what the ledgers held. They were a record of grinding, 70 and 80 years old, a name to a line, entered in a large, careful hand. But down the far column, where a miller sets the toll a family owes for the grinding of their grain, Josiah Rennick had written the same two words, over and over, hundreds upon hundreds of times, page after page after page. Paid full. Cora ran her finger down the column. The Teague family, ground and marked, paid full. The Colby family, paid full. A widow with 6 children, 3 separate winters, paid full, paid full, paid full. Family upon family through the hungry years, every one of them ground free of charge and set down, in that steady hand, as though the debt were long settled, though not 1 cent had ever crossed a palm. Ephraim had read these books every winter of his life, so as not to forget, he told her, and never once had a living soul to show them to. He had her turn to a page near the middle and read out one line: a young couple, a first child, a hard first winter, ground and marked, paid full. That was his own father and mother, he said, and the child was one of the sisters he had buried. Josiah had ground their grain free the year Ephraim was born, and set it down as paid so no man would carry the shame of a debt into wetter country. He forgave every toll of the drought years, Ephraim said quietly. Every single one. He gave this whole valley its bread, and then he gave it its pride along with the bread, and he wrote both down as paid full, so that the ledger itself would keep the lie kind. He looked at her then, and his old eyes were wet and steady both. That is your inheritance, Cora Rennick. Not a mill you cannot run, not a creek that will not come, a name that 100 families out there in the wide world still say soft when they say it at all. You come down from the man who fed a valley and let it keep its head up while he did it. There is no gold in this canyon. There never was. This, right here, is the gold. This was always the gold. Cora sat with the ledger open across her knees and wept, and was not ashamed of it, and Ephraim let her weep, and did not spoil it with a single word. That afternoon, while the old man rested, Cora climbed the mill from the ground floor to the top. She wanted to know every part of the place her family had raised, board by board, floor by floor. The ladder was gray and worn smooth by hands, and it took her weight without a groan, sound as she had been promised. The middle floor was where the grain had once been stored, a long room of empty bins, each one lettered in that same careful hand. Wheat, corn, rye, seed, do not grind. She trailed her fingers along the labels and felt strangely spoken to across the years. On the top floor she found Josiah's tools. They hung on a rack against the wall, each in its place, a wheelwright's and a miller's both. The wood of their handles gone dark with the oil of a working hand. A draw knife, a brace of augers, a mill pick worn down to a stub with the dressing of stone. Ephraim had kept them all bright, of course. Ephraim had kept everything. And there, in the loft where she had slept, low on a corner post where a small boy might reach, she found the letters, cut shallow into the timber with a pocket knife, a little crooked in the manner of a child. S.R. Silas Rennick. Her grandfather had carved his name into this post as a boy, and it had waited here for her across 70 years, in a canyon he never once brought himself to see again. Cora knelt and pressed her thumb into the grooves of the letters, and she understood then why he had held that river stone in his pocket to the last day he drew breath. He had not been able to come back. But neither had he ever truly left. He had carried this dry canyon inside him to the end of his days, and had given it to her at last with 3 folded words and a small gray stone, trusting that she would be braver than he had been. She stayed on. There was no decision in it, exactly. There was simply nowhere in the world she would rather be, and no one who needed her the way this old man plainly did. Through the days that followed, Ephraim began to teach her the mill, as Josiah had once taught Silas, as someone long ago had surely taught Josiah. He showed her how to dress a stone, how to read the pattern of the grooves and freshen them with the pick, tapping and turning, until the faces would bite grain clean instead of bruising it. He showed her how to grease the spindle and test the gears, how to read the timber for rot with the flat of a thumb, how to keep a roof sound against a rain that hardly ever fell. Her hands blistered and then hardened. She began, without quite noticing, to move about the place as though she belonged to it. There was a rhythm to the days, and Cora fell into it without deciding to. She rose before the sun and swept the doorway first, always first, because a swept sill, Ephraim said, was how a mill told the canyon it was still alive. She learned to test the balance of the runner stone by ear, spinning it a slow half-turn, and listening for the true low note that meant it sat level on its spindle. She learned which timbers drank the morning damp and which shed it. She learned the tools by feel, in the dark, so that her hands would know them even if the light should fail. Ephraim watched her learn with a quiet she came to know as happiness. Once, when she had freshened a worn groove clean on her first attempt, he set down his own pick and studied the stone a long moment without speaking. Then he said, mostly to himself, that Josiah would have liked her hands. It was the highest praise the old fellow owned, and Cora kept it like a minted coin. In the evenings they sat in the mill door and watched the light go, and Ephraim talked. And slowly, Cora came to see the shape of the whole long life he had spent alone in that canyon. He had married once, he told her. A girl named Nettie, from a family that came through Ryback a few years after the water left, hunting a shortcut to the coast, and finding this strange old man tending a mill in a dead creek. She had thought him half mad at first, he said, and then she had stayed, and they had been happy in the bowl of the canyon for near 30 years. She used to grind with me on the day the water came back, Ephraim said. The one day. I will tell you of that day before we are through. She has been gone a long while now. I buried her out on the bank yonder, next to Josiah, so she would not be alone, and so that I would know right where to lie down myself when my turn came. He was quiet a moment. It is a strange thing, child, to be the last one who remembers all the others. You start to feel less like a man and more like the ledger, just a place the names are kept dry. Cora reached over and took the old man's enormous scarred hand in both of hers, and neither of them said anything for a while, and nothing needed saying. She had come up the canyon an orphan, chasing a story. She was beginning to understand she had walked into a family instead, a strange, small family of two, held together by a dead man's faith and a mill that would not fall. It might have ended there, gentle and whole, a young woman come into the truth of who she was, and an old man no longer alone. But the world does not often leave a good thing be, and the world was already on its road up the canyon. It came in the shape of a man named Harlan Voss. He arrived on the 4th day, riding a good horse up the dry bed with 2 men behind him and a leather case of papers across his saddle. Cora saw him first from the mill door, a stranger in a town coat where no stranger should be, and something in her went cold before ever he opened his mouth. Ephraim came and stood at her shoulder, and she felt the old man go very still. He knew that breed, Ephraim murmured to her. Lo, he had seen it before, when the timber concerns came sniffing after the old stands. She was to let the man talk, let him show his hand, and keep her grandfather's deed where it was, and her own counsel besides. Voss drew up before the mill and looked it over, the leaning timbers and the great dead wheel, with the flat appraising eye of a man tallying board feet and dollars. He did not dismount. He touched his hat to Cora with a courtesy that held no warmth at all in it. Morning, he said. Harlan Voss, of the Alder Salvage and Timber Concern. I am given to understand this structure sits on an abandoned claim. He drew a paper from his case and glanced at it, though Cora felt certain he knew every word already. Ryback claim, filed near 70 years back. No improvement recorded. No tax paid in 30 years. No residence established. That makes it lapsed, and lapsed ground reverts, and I have filed lawful salvage upon it. These timbers are old growth, worth good money milled. And the stones inside are dressed French buer, worth a great deal more. I mean to have the lot of it out by the month's end. I tell you plainly, as a courtesy. There is nothing here for you. You are mistaken, Cora said, and was surprised her voice held steady. The claim is not abandoned, it is mine. My grandfather held it to the day he died, and I hold it now. Held it, Voss said, amused, held it from a rented room 200 miles off, with no soul living here, no wheel turning, and no tax paid. The law is not a sentimental creature, miss. Empty ground is empty ground. It is not empty, said Ephraim Teague. The old man stepped forward into the light, and Voss looked at him, and for the first time the smooth certainty in the salvage man's face flickered. Ephraim spoke slowly, and every word landed like a set stone. He had lived in this canyon 70 years without a day's leaving. He had kept the mill in constant use and repair the whole of that time, as any man in Kestrel would swear on a book. He had dressed the stones each season. He had kept the roof sound and the floor whole, and the doorway swept. There was no year of the last 70 that this mill had stood untended, and no honest recorder alive would paste the word abandoned on a place a man had cared for every day of his life. You have filed upon ground that was never empty a single hour, the old man finished. And I will say so, out loud, to the recorder's own face. So will the whole town that has watched me climb up this canyon since before your father drew breath. Voss's smile was quite gone now. An old squatter's word, he said, against a filed claim of salvage. We shall see how far that carries at the land office in Alder. We shall, Cora said. We shall see. I have my grandfather's deed recorded and dated. I have his father's improvements standing 3 stories tall behind you. And I have a witness who has lived on this ground longer than you have been alive. I will meet you at that land office, Mr. Voss, and I will bring every scrap of it. You had best bring more than a smile. For a moment the two of them held each other's eyes across the dry stones. Then Voss gathered his reins. Friday, he said. The recorder sat at noon. She was to bring her old man and her old paper, and he would bring the law. He wheeled his horse and rode back down the bed the same route he had come, his 2 men trailing after, and he did not look back once. Ephraim let out a long breath. The salvage man was not wrong about one thing, he said heavily. The law did love a filed paper, and a lapsed claim filing had thrown honest folk off their ground before this. All legal and all cold. They would need every scrap they had, and they would need the town to stand up and say what it had seen. It was a long stretch of hours until Friday. That evening the sky did a thing Cora had not seen it do since she came. It went green and bruised in the west, and a wall of cloud rose over the canyon rim tall as a mountain, and the air turned heavy and strange. Ephraim stood in the door and looked up at it, and something crossed his old face she could not name. Part dread and part a wild old hope. Big weather was coming down off the high rock, he told her. The kind that only visited this country once in a long while. And she must understand what such weather could do. When a storm like that broke over the spring country up top, all that water that ran down the black road beneath the mountain, sometimes, once in a great while, the mountain could not hold it all, and it came back up. It came down this canyon, the old road, the Creek's road, all at once and all at night. It has happened, but the once in my 70 years, the old man said, and his voice shook. Josiah lived to see it. The creek ran a single night, and this wheel turned, and the 2 of us ground 1 sack of grain by the old water before it sank away by dawn. He died 2 winters after, and he called that night the answer to his whole life's waiting. He gripped the doorframe, and his eyes streamed, and he was smiling. It is coming again, Cora. I feel it down in the rock. Tonight the water may come home to Ryback. She did not fully believe him. And then, past midnight, she did. It began as a sound. Far up the canyon, above the wind and the first hard rain, a low growing roar. Like a train, like the whole mountain clearing its throat. Ephraim was already up, already pulling on his boots with hands that shook, and he took her wrist in his great grip and drew her out under the eaves where they could see. The rain came sidelong and warm. The lightning walked along the canyon rim. And then, in one white flash that held for a heartbeat, Cora saw it come. Water, a wall of it, brown and roaring and alive, rolling down the bed of a creek that had run dry 70 years, tumbling the round stones ahead of it, filling the canyon floor from wall to wall. It came down the bowl like something set loose, like something come home, and it struck the base of the mill and rose foaming around the great dead wheel, and Cora felt the whole timber frame shudder beneath her feet. And then the wheel turned, not the idle quarter-inch of the night wind. It caught the flood full on its paddles, and it came around, slow and enormous and groaning, water sheeting off the old wood in silver ropes, around and around. Faster, until the whole mill woke and shook, and the great gears deep in its belly took up the turning with a shriek and a rumble, and below her, in the dark, the two grinding stones began to spin. Grain. Ephraim was shouting over the roar, laughing and weeping at once, already dragging a sack from the bin, the last of the seed he had kept for no reason on earth but faith. Grain, child, quick, we grind while she runs. Open the hopper. Open it wide. Korah threw the hopper open, and Ephraim poured, and the spinning stones bit down, and the whole mill filled with a smell she would carry to the end of her days, warm meal, and wet stone, and rain. And then it came. The flour, warm and pale, spilling from between the stones into her cupped and shaking hands, ground by a creek that had lain dead longer than anyone living could remember. In a mill her family had kept faith with across 3 generations and one old man's entire life. She held the warm flour, and she looked at Ephraim's streaming face in the lantern light, and at last, wholly, she believed every word her grandfather had ever told her. The water ran until near dawn. Then, exactly as the old man had said it would, it began to sink. The roar softened to a rush, the rush to a trickle, the trickle to a dark stain drawing back down into the stones. And by the time the sun cleared the canyon rim, Ryback Creek was a bed of wet rocks steaming in the early light, and then only a bed of rocks, and the wheel came slowly to rest at the angle of its last turn. But the sack of fresh flour sat upon the frame, real and warm, and it had happened, and Korah had seen it with her own eyes. Ephraim lowered himself heavily to the mill floor, spent all the way through, and he was smiling yet. Now she had seen it too, he said. Now there was one more soul in the world who knew the water kept its word, if a body only waited long enough to collect it. He could go easier for that. Josiah had always said that stone remembers what water lets slip. He had been right the whole time, and he had not lived to hear the valley say so. But she had heard it. She would carry it now. Korah did not answer for a while. She was thinking about Friday, and the land office at Alder, and a man named Voss who wanted to pull this mill down for board feet and dressed stone, and she was thinking that some things a person is not willing to let the law be cold about. They went to Alder on the Thursday, riding in a borrowed wagon, and half of Kestrel came along with them. That was Odell's doing. When word had gone round the store that a salvage man meant to condemn the Ryback mill and haul off old Ephraim's stones, something stirred in that little town that surprised even Korah. It turned out a great many people in that country had grandmothers and grandfathers who had left Ryback in the drought years, and every one of those old folk had handed down the same soft story of a miller named Rennick who fed a starving valley and marked every debt paid full. The name was not worthless out here. The name was very nearly holy, and no one had thought to tell Korah, because no one had known a Rennick was left to hear it. The recorder's office in Alder was a plain brick room with a slow ceiling fan and a spare gray man named Ambrose behind the rail, who had sat that seat 30 years and had, Korah would learn, no love at all for salvage filings that turned honest folk off their ground. Harlan Voss was there already, with his leather case and his 2 men and a hired lawyer besides, and he watched the crowd file in behind Korah. With a flicker of unease he quickly smoothed away. When the noon hour struck, Voss began, smooth as poured oil. The matter was simple, and the law was plain, he said. The Ryback claim showed no residence, no recorded improvement, no tax paid in 3 decades. It was lapsed. It reverted. He had filed lawful salvage upon it, and he asked the office to confirm the filing, so the property might be put to some use instead of rotting in a canyon no living person would ever trouble to see. Ambrose looked at him over his spectacles without any hurry. "That is your say," he answered. "Let us hear the other." Cora stood up. She had never spoken before an official in her life, and her hands shook on the rail. But she thought of the ledger and the warm flower and old Ephraim beside her, and she found she could speak after all. She gave her name, and Josiah's, and Silas's. She laid her grandfather's deed on the rail, recorded and dated in that very office. She said the salvage man claimed the ground showed no improvement, when there were 3 stories of milled timber standing on it that every soul in the room had seen. And she said the man had the most wrong on the matter of residence, and that she would let the person who had lived there speak to it himself. Ephraim Teague rose, slow and enormous and steady, and the whole room went quiet to make room for him. "I am Ephraim Teague," he said. "I am 80 years old. I have lived in Ryback Canyon, on that claim, every day of the last 70 of them, without a single year's leaving. I have kept that mill in repair the whole of that time. I have dressed the stones each season, kept the roof sound, kept the floor whole, kept the door swept. Recorder, send any man you trust up that canyon this very afternoon, and he will find no ruin. He will find a mill a man has tended like his own child every day of his life. There has not been 1 hour in 70 years that ground stood abandoned. I was on it. I am on it yet." A murmur moved through the crowd. Then old Odell stood, and then a woman beside him, and then a dozen more, and one by one they said it. They had seen Ephraim on that claim their whole lives. Their people had ground grain on those stones. The name Rennick had carried their grandparents through the hunger years and asked for nothing back. The room filled up with it, quiet and certain and unbudgeable. 70 years of a valley's memory standing up in a brick room to speak for one old man and one young woman and a mill in a dry canyon. Harlan Voss saw which road it had taken before the recorder ever spoke. Cora watched it happen in his face, the smooth certainty coming apart at the seams, the salvage arithmetic that had never once made room for a thing like this. Ambrose set down his pen. "Mr. Voss," he said, "without heat, a claim a man has lived upon and kept in repair for 70 unbroken years is not an abandoned claim, and I will not be the recorder who says that it is. Improvement is standing on the ground. Residence is proven by the whole of this county. Continuous care is beyond any doubt I can find. Your salvage filing is denied and struck from the book. The Ryback claim stands with the Rennick heir, whole and unencumbered, as it has stood all along." He looked at Cora, and something almost a smile touched his gray face. "Miss Rennick, your family's ground is your family's ground. It appears it always was. Welcome home." Voss gathered his case. He was undone, and he knew it, and to his small credit he did not bluster over it. He only paused a moment before Cora on his road to the door, and looked at her with a kind of tired wonder. He had condemned 100 old places, he said quietly, and not one of them had ever had a whole town walk in behind it. She was to keep her dry mill. He was beginning to think it had never been so worthless as the paper made it appear. And he went out, and that was the last the canyon ever saw of Harlan Voss. Cora Rennick did not go back east. She stayed in Ryback. She learned the mill from Ephraim through that autumn and the winter after, learned to dress a stone and grease a spindle and keep a roof sound, learned to read the sky for the big weather that visits that country once in a long while. and to keep a sack of seed always ready in the bin. When the great storms broke over the high rock, once or twice a year, and the creek came roaring back down its bed for a night the old road, she and Ephraim would grind by the returned water until dawn, and the smell of warm meal would fill the bowl of the canyon. And folk from Kestrel took to riding out to see it, the mill that woke when the water came home. She did not run it for money. There was no money in it, and there never had been, and she found that she did not want any. She ran it as Josiah had run it, as Ephraim had kept it, as a thing held in faith for whoever might one day need it, and they did come. The scattered families of the old valley, or their grandchildren, began to find their road up the canyon to see the place their people spoke of soft. They would stand in the swept doorway and lay a hand on the pale stones and say, "My grandmother ground her wheat here. We would have starved but for the Rennick who did this, and asked for nothing." Cora would show them their own name in the ledger, and the two kind words beside it, and more than one grown man wept in that doorway as she once had. Ephraim Teague lived 2 more years, long enough to teach her all of it, long enough to see her belong to the canyon as fully as he did. He died in the loft where Silas had slept as a boy, on a spring night with the door thrown open to the stars. "I kept faith," he told her at the end, and his voice was an old man's deep contentment. 70 years I held a light for a Rennick, and one came, and she was worth the keeping. Josiah, you old stubborn fool, I kept it. I kept it clear to the end." He smiled, and he was gone. Cora buried him on the bank of the dry creek beside her great-grandfather Josiah and his own Nettie, where the 3 of them could wait together for the water, which is a thing that always does come back to Ryback in the end, if a body is only patient enough to outlast the forgetting. She kept the mill the rest of her long life. She kept the ledgers dry and read them each winter, as Ephraim had taught her, so as never to forget the names. And when at last she was old herself, and a young one of her own blood came up the canyon uncertain of who they were, she sat them down on the cool mill floor and poured them a cup of water and told them the whole of it, from the shaking of the rock to the wheel turning in the flood, exactly as it had been told to her. If you had inherited a piece of ground the whole world called worthless, and walked 200 miles on the strength of a dead man's story, and found at the end of the road not gold but a name, and an old man's kept faith, and a wheel that still turned when the water came home, would you have counted that a poor inheritance, or would you have understood, as Cora did, that it was the richest thing a family could leave behind? Sit with that a while tonight, and let us know in the comments which part of this story will stay longest with you. And if you have made it this far up the canyon with us, thank you, truly, for staying to the end. If Cora and Ephraim and the old dry mill found their road into your heart tonight, leave a like so that more folk out there in the dark might find their road here too. Subscribe if you would care to sit with us again, for we have many more tales of the forgotten frontier waiting, and a place kept warm for you beside the lamp. The water forgets, but stone remembers. And so, if we take care, do we? We will see you next time.